What if I told you, toxic people aren't just being difficult? They're actually running a test on you every single day. The real question isn't why they do it. The real question is whether you pass the test or accidentally give them exactly what they want. Think about the last time someone pushed your buttons. Maybe they made a sarcastic comment, ignored your boundaries, or tried to make you feel guilty for saying no. That wasn't random. Toxic people probe for weakness. They throw small jabs, passive-aggressive comments, or emotional traps to see how much control they can gain over you. And the moment you overreact, defend yourself endlessly, or try to prove your worth, you've just shown them where the door is. But here's the good news. Once you understand the game, you can outsmart it every time. Toxic people often test boundaries because they want to understand how much influence or control they can have over someone. In many cases, this behavior is not random or accidental. It is a pattern where a person gradually pushes limits to see what another person will tolerate. These tests usually begin with very small actions. A toxic individual might interrupt you when you're speaking, make a sarcastic remark about your choices, ignore a request you made, or pressure you to do something you already said no to. At first, these actions can appear harmless or even playful, which is why many people overlook them. However, the purpose behind these small behaviors is to measure your reaction. If you stay silent, laugh it off, or allow the behavior to continue without addressing it, the toxic person often interprets that as permission to push further. Over time, the behavior may escalate into stronger forms of manipulation such as guilt-tripping, dismissing your feelings, or openly disrespecting your boundaries. The testing phase is essentially a way for them to map out your limits. They are observing whether you defend your time, your values, and your emotional space. If they notice that you hesitate to speak up or fear confrontation, they may continue increasing pressure because they believe there will be little resistance. On the other hand, when someone responds calmly and clearly the first time a boundary is crossed, the dynamic immediately changes. The toxic individual realizes that the person in front of them is aware of their limits and willing to protect them. This awareness reduces the opportunity for manipulation because boundaries act like a clear line that signals what behavior will and will not be accepted. Understanding this testing behavior helps people recognize that protecting boundaries early prevents toxic patterns from growing stronger. Toxic people often seek control or validation through their behavior, and this desire is one of the main reasons they test and challenge others. At the core of this pattern is usually insecurity, fear of losing influence, or a strong need to feel important. Instead of building confidence in healthy ways, they attempt to gain emotional power by influencing how others think, feel, or act. When they question your decisions, criticize your choices, or try to make you feel guilty, the goal is often to shift the balance of power in their favor. If they can make you doubt yourself or constantly look to them for approval, they gain a sense of control that temporarily boosts their self-esteem. Validation also plays a major role in this behavior. Some toxic individuals constantly seek reassurance that they are right, superior, or more capable than others. They may provoke arguments, create unnecessary drama, or challenge your opinions simply to force a reaction that confirms their importance. For example, if someone repeatedly dismisses your ideas or interrupts you, they may be trying to position themselves as the dominant voice in the conversation. When you react emotionally or try to prove yourself, it reinforces the attention and influence they were seeking. This dynamic often becomes a cycle. The more emotional energy someone gives in response, the more the toxic person feels rewarded. They learn that pushing buttons produces reactions, which strengthens their sense of control and validation. Over time, they may continue escalating their behavior because it consistently delivers the emotional response they want. Recognizing this pattern helps people understand that toxic behavior is rarely about the target person's worth or capability. Instead, It reflects the other person's attempt to manage their own insecurity by controlling the environment around them. When someone stops providing the emotional reactions that fuel this validation, the toxic individual often loses the influence they were trying to maintain. Toxic behavior rarely begins with obvious hostility or direct confrontation. Instead, it usually starts in subtle ways that are easy to overlook or dismiss. Small jokes, passive-aggressive comments, or slight dismissals are common early signs. A toxic person may say something that sounds like humor but carries a hidden insult, such as teasing you about your abilities, appearance, or decisions. If you react negatively, they may quickly respond with phrases like, "I was just joking," or "You're too sensitive." This tactic allows them to test how much disrespect you will tolerate while avoiding responsibility for their words. Another common subtle test appears in the form of guilt tripping. A person might pressure you to change your plans, give up your time, or agree to something you do not want. Instead of asking directly, they might say things like, "I guess you don't care about helping me," or "I thought you were different." These comments are designed to make you feel uncomfortable, so you give in just to restore harmony. At the same time, the toxic person is quietly measuring how easily your decisions can be influenced by emotional pressure. Dismissive behavior can also appear early in the interaction. For example, someone might interrupt you repeatedly, ignore your opinions, or minimize your concerns by saying things like, "It's not a big deal," or "You're overthinking it." These actions may seem minor on their own, but they gradually establish a pattern where your voice and boundaries become less respected. Because these behaviors are subtle, many people hesitate to address them. They may worry about overreacting or creating conflict, so they stay silent or brush the moment aside. Toxic individuals often rely on this hesitation. Each small test becomes a signal that tells them how far they can push in the future. When subtle behaviors go unchallenged, they often grow into stronger forms of manipulation, criticism, or disrespect over time. Emotional reactions often give toxic people the response they are looking for, which is why they deliberately create situations that trigger strong feelings. When someone reacts with anger, frustration, or defensiveness, it shifts the focus of the interaction. Instead of addressing the toxic behavior itself, the conversation turns into a reaction to the emotional outburst. This shift benefits the toxic person because it allows them to avoid accountability while still controlling the emotional atmosphere of the situation. Many toxic individuals understand that emotions can influence decisions and behavior. By provoking someone repeatedly, they can create stress or confusion that makes it harder for the other person to respond calmly. For example, a toxic person might criticize your work or question your abilities in front of others. If you react by arguing loudly or trying to defend yourself with long explanations, they gain attention and emotional influence over the situation. They may even portray you as overly dramatic or unstable, which further strengthens their position in the interaction. Another reason emotional reactions benefit toxic people is that they confirm the effectiveness of their tactics. When someone becomes visibly upset, it signals that the manipulation worked. This encourages the toxic individual to repeat the same behavior in the future because they know it produces a strong response. Over time, this can create a cycle where the toxic person continues provoking and the other person continues reacting, which keeps the unhealthy dynamic active. Emotional reactions can also drain a person's mental energy. After a heated interaction, people often replay the conversation in their minds, trying to justify their responses or think of better arguments they could have made. This ongoing stress keeps the toxic individual at the center of their attention, even after the conversation has ended. By learning to pause, remain calm, and avoid feeding the emotional drama, individuals can break the pattern that toxic people depend on to maintain influence. Before we continue, ask yourself something honestly. Have you ever dealt with someone like this? If yes, Take a second and let me know, because recognizing toxic patterns is the first step to beating them. Clear boundaries are one of the most effective ways to disrupt toxic behavior because they remove the uncertainty that toxic individuals rely on to push limits. A boundary is a direct statement about what behavior is acceptable and what is not. When someone communicates a boundary calmly and firmly, it creates a clear line that protects their time, energy, and emotional well-being. Toxic people often operate by slowly stretching limits, hoping the other person will stay silent or hesitate to confront the situation. Once a clear boundary is introduced, that gradual pressure becomes much harder to maintain. Many people struggle to set boundaries because they worry about appearing rude, selfish, or confrontational. Toxic individuals often take advantage of this hesitation. They might ask for favors repeatedly, speak disrespectfully, or ignore personal limits, assuming the other person will continue tolerating the behavior to avoid conflict. When a person finally responds with a calm and direct statement such as, "I'm not comfortable with that," or "Please don't speak to me that way," it interrupts the pattern that was forming. The toxic individual suddenly realizes that their behavior has been noticed and that further pressure will be challenged. The strength of a boundary does not come from aggression or long explanations. In fact, over-explaining can weaken the message because it invites arguments or attempts to negotiate the limit. Clear boundaries are simple and consistent. They communicate expectations without emotional escalation. For example, if someone repeatedly interrupts you, calmly stating that you would like to finish speaking before they respond, sends a clear signal about the behavior you expect. Over time, consistent boundaries reshape the dynamic between people. Toxic individuals often depend on confusion, emotional reactions, or silence to maintain influence. When someone repeatedly reinforces their limits in a calm and steady way, that uncertainty disappears. The toxic person either adjusts their behavior because the limits are clear, or they lose the ability to continue manipulating the situation in the same way. Silence and emotional detachment can be powerful tools when dealing with toxic behavior because they remove the reaction that toxic individuals often expect or depend on. Many toxic interactions are fueled by attention and emotional engagement. When someone provokes, criticizes, or creates drama, they are often trying to pull the other person into a heated exchange where emotions become the main focus. Responding immediately with anger, frustration, or long explanations can unintentionally reward this behavior by giving the toxic person the reaction they were seeking. Silence, when used intentionally, interrupts this pattern. Instead of responding to every comment or accusation, a person can choose not to engage in the provocation. This does not mean ignoring important issues or avoiding necessary communication. It simply means recognizing when a comment or action is meant to trigger an emotional response rather than start a constructive conversation. By remaining quiet or giving a short, neutral response, the situation does not escalate in the way the toxic individual expected. Emotional detachment works in a similar way. It involves creating a mental distance from the negative behavior so that it does not strongly affect one's feelings or decisions. Toxic people often rely on emotional pressure such as guilt, criticism, or exaggerated conflict to influence others. When someone learns to observe these behaviors without immediately reacting, it becomes easier to maintain control over their own responses. Instead of feeling compelled to defend themselves or argue, they can respond calmly or choose not to respond at all. Over time, this lack of emotional fuel can weaken toxic dynamics. When repeated attempts to provoke arguments or reactions fail, the toxic person may realize that their usual strategies are no longer effective. Silence and detachment shift the control of the situation back to the person who chooses when and how to engage, rather than allowing the toxic individual to dictate the emotional tone of the interaction. Consistency is one of the most important elements in dealing with toxic behavior because boundaries only become effective when they are maintained over time. When someone sets a boundary once but allows it to be crossed later, it sends mixed signals. Toxic individuals often pay close attention to these signals because they reveal whether the limit is truly firm or simply a temporary reaction. If a person says they will not tolerate a certain behavior but later accepts it again, the toxic individual may interpret that as permission to continue pushing the boundary. Many people struggle with consistency because enforcing boundaries can feel uncomfortable. After setting a limit, a toxic person might react with frustration, guilt-tripping, or attempts to negotiate. They may say things like, "You're overreacting," "You used to be okay with this," or "Why are you making such a big deal out of it?" These responses are often designed to pressure the other person into relaxing the boundary. If the person gives in during these moments, the toxic individual learns that persistence will eventually weaken the limit. Consistency changes this dynamic by showing that the boundary is stable and non-negotiable. Each time the behavior appears, the response remains the same: calm, direct, and firm. There is no long debate, emotional argument, or change in standards depending on the situation. Over time, this repeated response builds credibility. The toxic person begins to understand that the limit will not disappear just because they challenge it. Consistent boundaries also help the person maintaining them feel more confident. When someone repeatedly stands by their limits, it reinforces their sense of self-respect and control over their environment. Instead of constantly questioning whether they should tolerate certain behaviors, they rely on a clear standard that guides their responses. This stability gradually removes the uncertainty that toxic individuals often exploit when they attempt to manipulate or pressure others. Protecting your peace is the ultimate outcome when learning how to deal with toxic people, because the real goal is not to defeat them in arguments or prove them wrong. Many people initially believe that the solution is to confront every toxic comment, correct every unfair statement, or win every disagreement. However, this approach often drains emotional energy and keeps the toxic individual at the center of attention. The more time and mental space someone spends trying to manage another person's behavior, the less energy they have for their own well-being, goals, and relationships. Toxic individuals often thrive in environments where conflict, drama, or emotional reactions are frequent. When someone constantly tries to defend themselves, argue back, or explain their intentions, the toxic person remains deeply involved in their life. Even after the conversation ends, the mind may continue replaying the situation, thinking about what should have been said differently, or worrying about the next interaction. This cycle quietly steals focus and emotional balance. Protecting your peace means recognizing that your mental and emotional stability are more valuable than winning a momentary debate. It involves choosing where to place your attention and deciding which interactions deserve your energy. When someone focuses on maintaining calmness, respecting their own boundaries, and avoiding unnecessary emotional battles, they begin to shift their priorities away from toxic dynamics. This approach also strengthens personal control. Instead of allowing someone else's behavior to determine how the day feels or how emotions fluctuate, the person chooses responses that preserve their sense of stability. Calmness, distance from unnecessary conflict, and careful selection of interactions gradually reduce the influence toxic individuals can have. Over time, the focus moves away from reacting to negativity and toward building healthier relationships, clearer thinking, and a more balanced emotional environment. In the end, understanding toxic behavior changes the way you respond to it. Toxic people test boundaries, seek control or validation, and often start with small, subtle actions to see how much influence they can gain. They rely heavily on emotional reactions because strong emotions give them the attention and power they are looking for. When someone becomes aware of these patterns, the dynamic begins to shift. Clear boundaries interrupt manipulation. Silence and emotional detachment remove the reaction that fuels the behavior, and consistent responses make it clear that certain limits will not change. Over time, these strategies weaken the toxic cycle because the person who once reacted emotionally now responds with calm awareness and control. Outsmarting toxic people is not about winning arguments or proving them wrong. It is about understanding the game they play and choosing not to participate in it. When someone protects their time, energy, and emotional balance, they take back control of their environment. The greatest success in dealing with toxic individuals is not changing them, but ensuring that their behavior no longer has the power to disturb your peace.